The year is 1177. Picture this for a moment. You're standing with 500 exhausted knights, your horses foaming at the mouth after a forced march that should have killed half of them. The November sun beats down unnaturally hot for late autumn, turning your armor into a personal furnace. Your scouts have just returned, with news that makes grown men weep. Not 20,000 enemies, as you feared, but 26,000 of Islam's finest warriors spread across the horizon like a plague of locusts. That's 52 enemies for every one of your brothers. The mathematics of annihilation are simple, brutal, and final. Yet in 2 hours, 20,000 of those warriors will be dead. The most powerful Muslim army assembled since the First Crusade will cease to exist. A dying teenage boy with bandaged hands will achieve what seasoned commanders called impossible, what military science said couldn't happen, what even God seemed to have forbidden. Think about those numbers again. 500 against 26,000. The fate of Christian civilization in the Holy Land, perhaps in Europe itself, hangs by a thread so thin it's invisible. By sunset, that thread will become an iron chain. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see medieval warfare forever. First, the tactical mistakes Saladin made that no historian predicted. Second, why elite Mamluk warriors who'd never known defeat fled on racing camels. Third, the moment when Baldwin IV, a leper king who couldn't feel his own hands, raised a sword that shouldn't have been possible for him to grip and changed history. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you about that morning. Baldwin IV wasn't supposed to be alive, much less leading an army. Leprosy had been eating away at his body since childhood. By 16, his hands were so damaged they needed to be wrapped in silk bandages just to prevent them from falling apart. His face, hidden behind a silver mask, concealed features so ravaged that courtiers couldn't look at them without flinching. Physicians had given him months to live 3 years ago. Every morning he woke up was a medical impossibility. Every time he mounted a horse was an act of will that defied physical reality. Facing him stood Saladin, the Sword of Islam, a man who had united the fractured Muslim world through a combination of military genius and genuine piety. At 40, he commanded an empire stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates. His treasury held the wealth of Egypt. His armies had crushed every Christian force sent against them. His reputation alone had caused entire garrisons to surrender without firing a single arrow. While Baldwin fought his own decaying flesh, Saladin commanded over 100,000 warriors across his territories. The power dynamic wasn't just lopsided, it was laughable. Jerusalem itself was preparing for the end. Ships waited in the harbours of Acre and Tyre, loaded with the possessions of nobles who knew what was coming. Secret negotiations were already underway with Muslim commanders about the terms of surrender. The smart money said the Kingdom of Jerusalem had weeks, maybe days. The total Crusader forces across all their territories could muster perhaps 15,000 men, scattered across dozens of castles and cities. Saladin's current army alone, this force of 26,000, was nearly double everything the Christians could theoretically field, and this wasn't even his main force. Here's the reality that November morning, Baldwin could scrape together only 500 knights, including just 80 Knights Templar, those warrior monks who took vows to never retreat, never surrender, never show mercy to Islam's armies. Supporting them were barely 3,000 infantry, many of them local levies, armed with little more than farm tools and desperate courage. Against them, Saladin had brought 8,000 elite Mamluk cavalry, slave soldiers trained from childhood to be perfect killing machines. But as autumn turned to winter in 1177, intelligence reports brought news that would force the dying king to attempt the impossible. Inside Jerusalem's throne room, the war council had devolved into barely controlled panic. Baldwin IV had to be carried in on a litter, his legs no longer able to support even his diminished weight. The November cold that should have provided relief instead sent spasms of agony through his diseased nerves. Every knight in that chamber knew what the scouts had reported. Saladin's 26,000 were moving north from Ascalon, bypassing the fortress entirely, heading straight for Jerusalem. The city's garrison numbered fewer than 1,000 men. Most were old, young, or wounded. The arithmetic was murder. Raymond of Tripoli, the kingdom's most experienced commander, spoke what everyone was thinking. "My lord, you must flee to Tyre. The kingdom needs its king alive, not dead in a hopeless last stand. Others nodded agreement. Gérard de Ridefort suggested terms of surrender might still be negotiated. Even Renaud of Châtillon, that savage who'd never counselled retreat in his life, remained silent. The situation was that desperate. Then, Baldwin did something that stunned even his closest advisers. Despite hands that could barely close, despite a body that screamed with every movement, he demanded to be lifted to a sitting position. His voice, when it came, was clear and carried to every corner of that stone chamber. "Gentlemen, I may die tomorrow or in 10 years, but I will die as I lived, defending this kingdom. God gave me this disease for a purpose. When we achieve victory, no man can claim it was by human strength alone." The room erupted. Victory? Had the disease finally reached his mind? Odo de Saint-Amand, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was the first to understand. His warrior monks had taken vows to die rather than retreat. If a dying boy could face annihilation with faith, how could they do less? One by one, the knights began to kneel, not in submission, but in something far more powerful: belief. What happened next defied every principle of military logic. Instead of preparing Jerusalem's defences, Baldwin ordered an immediate march, not away from Saladin's host, but directly toward it. The knights would leave within the hour, taking every man who could hold a weapon. The insanity of the plan was breathtaking. March exhausted forces 45 miles through hostile territory to attack an enemy that outnumbered them 50-1. Here's what military historians still can't explain. The march that followed should have killed half the force before they ever saw the enemy. 45 miles in 36 hours. Men in full armour, already exhausted from weeks of constant alerts. Horses pushed beyond endurance. The November heat, unseasonably brutal, turned the road into a furnace. Knights began collapsing after hour 10. By hour 20, men were hallucinating from dehydration. The Templars took turns carrying Baldwin's litter when he lost consciousness from pain, which happened every few miles. Blood seeped through his bandages from wounds that refused to heal. At one point, near the village of Ibelin, witnesses saw the king's body convulsing so violently that 4 knights had to hold him down. Yet when he regained consciousness, his first words were always the same: "Continue the march." Meanwhile, Saladin had made the fatal decision that would cost him everything. Completely confident in his overwhelming superiority, he'd allowed his army to scatter across 3 miles of countryside. Foraging parties roamed freely. Discipline relaxed. His scouts had reported Jerusalem's walls barely manned. Why maintain battle formation when marching to an execution? His emirs were already dividing up the conquered lands among themselves, arguing over who would get the richest estates. The Sultan himself had brought his entire treasury, planning not a battle, but an occupation. By dawn on November 25th, Baldwin's impossible march had covered ground that maps said couldn't be crossed in that time. Scouts brought electrifying news. Saladin's army wasn't formed for battle. They were scattered, relaxed, unprepared. God had delivered them exactly as Baldwin had prophesied. November the 25th dawned clear and hot, and Saladin's scouts had made a mistake that would cost 20,000 lives. 6 o'clock in the morning brought the first gift from God, or perhaps from Baldwin's tactical genius. The king's scouts, Turcopoles, who knew this land like their own skin, returned with news that made even exhausted knights stand straighter. Saladin's mighty host wasn't arranged for battle. They were scattered across 3 miles of rolling countryside, foraging parties spreading out like fingers from a careless hand. Supply wagons sat unguarded. Horse lines were dispersed. The Muslim army looked less like a military force and more like a migration. The Templar Grand Master, Odo de Saint-Amand, rode to Baldwin's litter. "Sire, God has delivered them into our hands." But even he couldn't hide the fear in his voice when he added the next part. "The enemy numbers are worse than we thought. Not 20,000, 26,000. Their banners darken the horizon." Some knights openly wept at this news. Others fell to their knees in prayer. 52-1. The mathematics had become even more impossible. At 11 o'clock, Saladin received his first warning: dust clouds to the north, moving fast. His initial reaction, recorded faithfully by Ibn al-Athir, was complete disbelief. His scouts had confirmed Jerusalem's walls were barely manned. Baldwin wouldn't dare leave their protection. It had to be a scouting party, perhaps raiders hoping to harass his supply lines. He sent orders for a few squadrons to investigate, nothing more. This overconfidence would haunt him forever. By noon, the terrible truth became undeniable. Crusader banners appeared on the ridgeline, not scout pennants, but the great war standards, the blood-red cross of the Templars, the golden crosses of Jerusalem, the personal banner of Baldwin IV himself. Saladin's scattered forces began frantically trying to reform their lines. But 3 miles is an eternity when your enemy is already formed and ready. Commands in Arabic, Turkish, and Kurdish crashed into each other as officers tried to organize the chaos. Here's where legend meets reality. Military logic demanded Baldwin wait. Let Saladin organize his forces, then retreat to defensible ground. Draw them into prepared positions. Use the terrain. Every manual of war, every precedent of battle said the same thing. Never charge a superior force on open ground. Never attack when outnumbered. Never gamble everything on a single moment. Baldwin was about to violate every one of these rules. Despite agony that would have killed most men, the leper king demanded to be lifted from his litter and placed on his war horse. Knights rushed to strap him to the saddle, his legs useless, his hands barely able to grip the reins. Blood seeped through his bandages, where the straps cut into diseased flesh. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried across the entire Christian line. Gentlemen, David faced Goliath with faith. We faced 26,000 with God. The Muslim army's reaction tells us everything about their shock. Elite Mamluks, warriors who'd faced Byzantine cataphracts and Nubian cavalry without flinching, simply froze. For precious seconds, they couldn't process what they were seeing. 500 knights forming a charge formation against 26,000 wasn't warfare. It was mass suicide. Saladin himself, watching from his command position, dropped his golden mace. The greatest military commander of the age couldn't comprehend the insanity unfolding before him. Then, Baldwin noticed something Saladin had missed. The seemingly flat plains were cut by a series of ravines, invisible from distance but deadly for fleeing cavalry. What looked like open ground was actually terrain that would funnel retreating men into natural killing grounds. The young king had recognized what Saladin's experience had overlooked. Those ravines would become channels of death. Madness, Saladin whispered, then louder to his panicking officers. Form lines. Form lines! But forming battle lines from scattered foraging parties takes time. Time Baldwin wasn't going to give them. At exactly 2 o'clock, the leper king raised his bandaged hand, the signal his knights had been praying for. 500 lances dropped to charging position. At exactly 2 o'clock, Baldwin raised his bandaged hand, and 500 men began charging 26,000. 2 o'clock struck like the hammer of God himself. The Templar wedge, 80 knights formed into a human spear, smashed into the half-formed Muslim centre at full gallop. The sound was like mountains colliding, a crash that men 5 miles away claimed they heard. In those first seconds, 300 Mamluks simply ceased to exist, crushed under iron-shod hooves or transfixed by 12-foot ashwood lances that punched through mail and flesh like parchment. But the real shock wasn't the impact. It was what followed. Instead of wheeling away after the charge, standard cavalry doctrine, the Templars did the unthinkable. They kept going, driving deeper into Muslim ranks like a blade seeking a heart. Behind them, Baldwin's 420 secular knights struck in a second wave, exploiting the gap torn by the warrior monks. The charge covered 300 yards in under a minute. 500 ironclad horsemen moving like an avalanche, their battle cry of Deus Vult, drowning out Muslim commanders' desperate orders. At 500 yards, Muslim arrows began falling like rain. Knights fell, Horses screamed and tumbled, but the charge never wavered. At 200 yards, the full terror of what was coming became clear to the Muslim front ranks. These weren't just knights, they were fanatics, men who believed death in battle guaranteed paradise. The Templars especially, with their black and white banner streaming overhead, came on like demons from Christian hell. 2:15 brought the first impossible moment. Saladin's centre, 8,000 of Islam's finest cavalry, began to buckle. Not retreat, buckle, like a dam cracking under pressure. The Muslim commanders couldn't believe their eyes. How could 500 exhausted knights be pushing back 16 times their number? The physics didn't work. The mathematics were impossible. Yet it was happening. Then something occurred that defied all military logic. The Crusader horses, exhausted from their forced march, should have been failing. Instead, they fought like creatures possessed. War horses bit and kicked, adding to the carnage. One Templar mount, its rider dead, continued charging through Muslim ranks, trampling warriors, spreading panic by its very existence. The beast finally collapsed, after taking 17 arrows, but not before its rampage had broken an entire squadron. 2:30 saw panic begin its deadly work. A Mamluk regiment on Saladin's left wing, seeing the centre collapse, began edging backward. In battle, hesitation is contagious. Within minutes the backward drift became a stream. Commands became screams. Formation dissolved into chaos. The impossible was happening. 26,000 warriors were being routed by a force they outnumbered 52-1. But then came Baldwin's masterstroke. His 3,000 infantry, hidden in dead ground during the cavalry charge, suddenly appeared on the Muslim flank. The psychological impact was devastating. To Saladin's already rattled forces, it seemed Crusader armies were materializing from nowhere. Shouts of "we're surrounded" spread through Muslim ranks. Militarily nonsense, but panic doesn't calculate odds. Baldwin himself, strapped to his saddle, bleeding from stress-reopened wounds, raised his sword. The gesture was impossible. His diseased hands shouldn't have been able to grip the weapon, yet every chronicle, Christian and Muslim alike, records it. The Leper King was leading from the front. At 50 yards, Muslim horses began backing despite their riders' efforts. Animals sensed doom, and doom was seconds away. The ground literally shook under thousands of hooves. Dust clouds rose like smoke. The noise was indescribable, thunder mixed with war cries in 3 languages. The clash of weapons being readied, prayers screamed to 2 different gods. Muslim arrows darkened the sky, but the Crusaders came on, unstoppable, inevitable, terrifying. 2:45 marked the moment when battle became massacre. As Muslim forces tried to flee, they discovered Baldwin's tactical genius. Those ravines that looked like escape routes became death traps. Knights pursued fleeing Muslims straight into these natural killing grounds. But then at 3 o'clock something happened that even Muslim chroniclers called divine punishment. 3 o'clock brought the unthinkable. Saladin's personal guard, 2,000 Mamluks who'd sworn to die before abandoning their sultan, broke. These were men who'd faced Mongol cavalry without flinching, who wore their scars like holy relics. Yet faced with Templars who fought like men seeing paradise, they ran. The sight shattered what remained of Muslim morale. If the elite guard fled, what hope did common soldiers have? Saladin himself, watching his invincible army disintegrate, made a decision that would haunt him forever. Abandoning his war horse, too slow for escape, he mounted a racing camel. The sight of their sultan fleeing on a pack animal destroyed the last Muslim resistance. His golden armor glinted in the afternoon sun as he disappeared into the dust, leaving behind an army that had ceased to exist as a fighting force. 3:30 saw pursuit become annihilation. Crusader knights, their blood up, chased fleeing Muslims for miles. The killing was mechanical, efficient, horrible. Lances broken, they used swords. Swords blunted. They used maces. Some Templars, their weapons lost, beat enemies to death with their helmets. The very ground became slippery with blood. Those ravines Baldwin had identified became charnel houses. Muslims, fell in layers, the dead cushioning the dying suffocating under more dead. Some ravines literally filled with bodies, creating bridges of flesh others tried to cross. Modern historians still can't explain this part. How did 500 exhausted knights maintain pursuit for 2 hours? How did horses near death from marching find strength to run down fresh Muslim cavalry? The Christian chroniclers had an answer. God's strength flowed through them. The Muslim chroniclers, horrified, agreed. This was divine punishment. Ibn al-Athir wrote that Allah had turned his face from them that day. 4 o'clock brought scenes that haunt the records. The pursuit only ended when Crusader horses finally collapsed, their mighty hearts giving out after achieving the impossible. Baldwin himself had fought despite agony that defies description. Knights later swore they saw tears of blood seeping from beneath his silver mask, his diseased body literally weeping from the effort. Yet his voice never wavered, calling encouragement, directing the slaughter with tactical brilliance. By 4:30, Muslim dead carpeted the field for 3 miles. Bodies clogged the ravines 20 feet deep. Abandoned weapons littered the ground like iron seeds. The streaming banners of Islam's greatest army lay trampled in mud, made from dust and blood. The numbers stagger even now. Of 26,000 warriors who woke that morning, fewer than 2,000 saw sunset. 20,000 Muslim dead. The Crusaders lost 1,100 men, heavy losses from just 3,500 engaged, but nothing compared to the Islamic catastrophe. The immediate material gains defied calculation. Saladin's army had carried wealth to sustain a long campaign. Gold, weapons, horses, supplies for 26,000 men. In 3 hours, it all became Crusader property. The Templars alone captured enough military equipment to outfit every Christian fortress in the Levant. More importantly, they captured Saladin's war chest, literal tons of gold meant to pay his army. In one afternoon, the bankrupt kingdom of Jerusalem became solvent. Baldwin, finally allowing himself to be lifted from his horse, collapsed immediately. Knights rushed to support their dying king, but he waved them away, insisting on one final act. There on that field of death, the leper king led his exhausted army in prayer. Non nobis, Domine, they chanted. Not to us, Lord. Not to us, but to your name give glory. The sight of 500 blood-soaked killers kneeling in prayer while surrounded by 20,000 corpses struck even hardened warriors as surreal. Saladin's humiliation was complete. The man who'd never known defeat arrived in Cairo with fewer than 2,000 survivors. His racing camel had saved his life, but destroyed his reputation. Warriors who flee on pack animals don't inspire loyalty. As the sun set on that blood-soaked field, the impossible had become history. The strategic implications were staggering. Saladin's power base in Egypt nearly collapsed from the defeat. Syria questioned their allegiance. The careful alliance he'd built over decades cracked in a single afternoon. Military historians calculate it took Saladin 10 years to rebuild a force comparable to what Baldwin destroyed in 3 hours. The Crusader states, granted this miraculous reprieve, gained time they'd never dared hope for. Time to fortify, time to negotiate, time to summon help from Europe. The Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir, usually sympathetic to Islamic causes, couldn't hide the scope of the disaster. He called it the most terrible catastrophe to befall Islam in this age. Another wrote simply, God turned his face from us that day. The psychological impact on the Muslim world was devastating. If 26,000 couldn't defeat 500 Christians, what did that say about divine favor? Mosques, from Cairo to Damascus, filled with believers seeking answers. Some blamed sin, others questioned faith itself. Jerusalem erupted in celebration when news arrived. Church bells rang for 3 days straight. But in the royal chamber, Baldwin IV lay dying. The battle's physical toll on his ravaged body was catastrophic. Physicians warned he might not survive the night. Yet somehow, Impossibly, the leper king endured. When asked how he'd found strength to fight, Baldwin whispered, "Pain means nothing when God requires service." For 10 years after that bloody November day, Saladin approached the Crusader states with newfound caution. The man who'd swept all before him had learned that numbers alone don't guarantee victory, not when facing an enemy willing to die for their cause. The economic windfall from captured treasures funded Crusader defenses for a decade. New castles rose, old ones were reinforced. The military orders recruited aggressively, their ranks swelling with men inspired by Montgisard's impossible victory. Baldwin IV continued his impossible reign for 8 more years, each one a medical miracle. The boy who shouldn't have lived past childhood commanded respect from enemies who outnumbered him 50-1. Even as his body literally fell apart, by the end he was blind and couldn't walk. His mind remained sharp, his courage unbroken. When he finally died in 1185 at age 24, Saladin himself reportedly said, "I feared that man more than any army." The tragic irony strikes hard. Just 2 years after Baldwin's death, Saladin reconquered Jerusalem. Without the leper king's inspired leadership, the Crusader states crumbled. The kingdom Baldwin had saved with 500 knights couldn't survive without him. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin destroyed the Crusader army using lessons learned from Montgisard. Never underestimate desperate men. Never assume victory before battle is joined. Never let confidence become carelessness. Modern military academies still study Montgisard as the ultimate example of psychological warfare. Baldwin understood something Saladin missed. In battle, morale matters more than mathematics. 500 men who believe God fights beside them are worth more than 26,000 who doubt. The leper king's true genius wasn't tactical. It was making his knights believe the impossible was inevitable. The battle's legacy echoes through centuries. When Churchill spoke of their finest hour, when 300 Spartans held Thermopylae, when any hopeless stand succeeds against overwhelming odds, we see Montgisard's shadow. It remains proof that sometimes, just sometimes, courage counts more than counting. But here's where it gets even more profound. Both Christian and Muslim sources agree something supernatural occurred that day. How else to explain 500 defeating 26,000? How else to understand exhausted horses outrunning fresh ones? How else to comprehend a dying teenager outgeneraling history's greatest Muslim commander? In the end, Montgisard stands as history's most glorious last stand, a moment when the impossible became reality, when 500 stood against 26,000 and won, when a leper king's bandaged hands held back the tide of history itself, even if only for a moment.